Again, welcome everybody to Drupal Providence. We're all here virtually. I wanted to give a little update. If you're not aware and you host a community event, you can now do that on Drupal.org. So if you go to Drupal.org/community/events, that is where all the events should live. You can see all your events there. There's instructions on how you could post an event there. AmyJune is very familiar with that. So if anybody here needs help, she could probably point you in the right direction. Also, Drupal Slack, if you are there, you can join the Providence channel. I would like to note that previously it was the Drupal Providence channel, but in an effort to streamline things and give everybody one less Slack channel, I am moving my communications to the Providence channel, and I'm going to ask the DA or whoever manages Slack to archive the Drupal Providence channel. So just know that you can catch up with us on Drupal Slack. I'd also like to take a second to thank the New England Drupal Camp. They are donating this Zoom line to us for our use for this event. So thank you to them. Session submissions are open. So if you want to attempt to attend an in-person conference in November and speak at said conference, you can submit a session. We'd love to hear what you have to offer. Couple of events happening in the next couple of months. It's funny, Q4 is a very busy year for a very busy part of the year for Drupal, or so it seems. Drupal Camp Atlanta is the 9th and the 10th of September, online and virtual, or virtually online, depending on how you want to read that. The 17th and 18th of September is the Contributors Mentoring Summit, also online and virtual. GovCon is coming up. Hey, you know what? I didn't change the title underneath GovCon. That definitely says SF Doug. But Drupal GovCon is the 10th, is October 12th through the 15th. And again, that is going to be virtual. If you have a good time tonight, or even if you don't have a good time tonight and you want to come to the next Drupal Providence, that's going to be in December 9th. And we're going to have the folks from Search Stacks in to talk about hosted Solr and the search services they provide. So join us in December and learn about Search Stacks. It's going to be awesome. Okay. So the main event, we have three wonderful speakers with us tonight to talk about Simply Test Me. Adam Bergstein, Matt Glaman, and AmyJune Hineline. I will let them introduce themselves, but let's give them a warm virtual welcome.
We made a little talk discussing Simply Test Me. It's titled "The Future Built from the Past," and we're going to do a little sort of history lesson and talk about where the project is going and what we're doing. A lot of exciting things are happening in this space right now, and we'll elaborate a bit more on that in the coming moments. So without further ado, some presenters. So my name is Adam. I know all or most of you on the call. Thanks for having us here today. We're excited to be able to give this presentation, and thank you for letting us do that. I'm the lead of Simply Test Me, so we'll talk about the history in a little bit, but I had taken it over about 2.5 years ago at this point, I believe, and have been working to maintain the current system and also kick off these new efforts that we've been doing. So we'll talk significantly more about that. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Matt. Some of you may know me. I do a lot of stuff with Drupal Commerce and PHP Stand Drupal. And back around the holidays, connected with Adam. Holidays this past year, connected with Adam, and I was like, I've always wanted to work on Simply Test Me. And he's like, hey, I really need help. And finally took to dive in. Since I made the change from Centauro to running my own agency, I was able to be a little bit more in control of my own time and dove right in.
Awesome. And we're grateful for that. And AmyJune, how about you?
I'm AmyJune Hineline. I work at Canopy Studios, but I mostly work in the community as a community ambassador. And I'm also the community ambassador for Simply Test Me Too. And that just means I do a lot of the promotions, making sure that people are aware about us. I evangelize the project. I help find new contributors and that kind of stuff, because this project is really near and dear to my heart for lowering the barrier to Drupal development in general. Thanks, Adam.
Awesome. A little bit of an agenda just of sort of where we're going to head with this talk tonight. AmyJune's going to review the mission and vision of the project and where we've been historically. Then we're going to get into the project history, a little timeline of when it started, what it was, and then we're going to get into where we're going with the project. We're going to spend some time on some key elements of that future direction around what we're doing with Drupal 9, what we've done with Tugboat QA, and then we'll spend some time doing some questions. So without further ado, AmyJune, I'm going to kick it off to you. Give me a little boop when you want me to adjust the slides, and I'll move it forward.
Okay. So with this slide, you don't have to boop it yet. I just want to give a little background about me and why this project is important. It's kind of a little inspirational. I come from a non-technical background, and I don't mean that to be reductive. I really do come from a non-technical background, no design skills, no anything like that, and definitely no coding. And so when I first got into Drupal, I found out about this project where I didn't have to spend 3 hours crying to get a local environment up. Someone, showed me this project, and it changed the way I felt about Drupal. And so that's why it's important to me, and continuing the mission of that, lowering the barrier to Drupal, not just Drupal entry, but development and coding and design and all that kind of stuff, and contributions. So you boop. So the project has always had the same sort of goals. One of them being lowering that barrier to entry for Drupal. And one of the most, the key aspect of that is making sure that it's a free tool, because someone's socioeconomic status does take into account how much they can contribute to Drupal. Whether or not they have a local machine, Simply Test Me allows that freedom of being able to use it at the library on an internet browser. But also what the project does is it allows us to test things and share our tests with people across the world. With a one push button or a couple of different configurations, we can test different instances of Drupal. We have sandboxes that people can open up. You can try out different configurations. Say you're on the marketing team and want to show a client, a landing page. You can spin up a site on Simply Test Me in a matter of minutes, do some configurations, and share a URL across the globe. And then for contributions is also something that is a privilege for some folks. And Simply Test Me allows an easier path to test patches. And when there's changes to projects, instead of it having to create a local environment and take, 20 minutes and download a database, Simply Test Me just has that one button. And some of you might ask, well, are we really doing patches anymore? What about merge requests? Yes, we are still doing patching, because patching is quick and patching is easy. And so allowing Simply Test Me to have that space to test patches is really important for onboarding new contributors. We've worked with developers and different agencies and different profiles. So there's different one-click installations that we have that makes Drupal really easy. A lot of people want to try out Commerce, and so there's a one-click demo for Commerce where you can spin up the easy out-of-the-box Umami, or the out-of-the-box Umami project. And that way you can show clients a fully built recipe website, just with the push of the button. And then, back to that contributions, if people aren't familiar, Simply Test Me has its own site that you can spin up, and you can put in the configurations you want in a patch URL, but there's also an extension available for contributions called Dreditor. And what Dreditor does is it injects a few more buttons into the issue queue for ease of use for contributions. And one of those buttons is simply test me. So you don't even have to leave the issue queue. You can click on a button, it spawns the site, it puts in the version, the specific project you're working on, what version of core, and it also injects the patch URL. So it really makes first-time contributions super easy. And the next slide is a picture of simply test me in the issue queue. So sometimes, you know, people will look at my issue queue and it'll look a little bit differently, but this is that Dreditor extension that we put in there. And it does a couple of things, you know, it puts a review button in, and it also puts in that simply test me button. As far as I know, Dreditor is only available for Chrome and sometimes Firefox. There's like kind of iffy whether or not it's always available for Firefox. But it definitely is something, especially if you're a mentor, to help people, you know, lower that barrier to Drupal contributions. The next slide, Adam. So learning Drupal, you know, we've seen that learning curve of Drupal and how difficult it is. And one of the things that's difficult is that local environment, you know, and so for some folks, they don't get past that. So sometimes just having that one less barrier really helps. So, you know, testing out Drupal and opening up a website in a matter of minutes without having to have any sort of Git installed in your machine, or, you know, Lando or DDev or Acquia Dev Desktop or what, I guess that's antiquated now, but what, you know, local by Flywheel, any of those things, you know, that you spin up a Drupal site with, you know, it allows that learning process to be a little bit easier. You can test the configurations, you can look at the menus, you can open taxonomies, you know, without that 20-minute struggle and perhaps a tier, you know, a set of tiers at the end. And it's really about community. It's about building our community, because without our new contributors and without our new developers, we wouldn't have a community. And our community is diverse and it grows because of the new relationships that we have with these people. So this project really sort of centers on that. You know, we want to make sure that everyone who wants to work on Drupal has access to it. You know, we see a lot of these new things come up, but they're paid for services, you know, so maintaining that lower barrier to entry to have this be completely free is super important to us. And so with saying that, we need help, and you can forward it, Adam. There's different spaces that we work, you know, Simply Test Me is a completely collaborative project. We work in the issue queue. And we always have a need for new contributors, especially because we're rebuilding the framework. So, so we need people to test the software, not only people who are used to using the software, but people new to the software too. How easy is the interface to use? Because it's important for us to have new contributors and new developers use our software. So if you know someone new, they're sometimes the perfect people for testing this, for testing the new framework. We have a community project on Drupal.org, so we provide community credits for folks who help out, you know, as an incentive. Our core mentors who teach classes at DrupalCon, you know, on code contributions, we promote Dreditor and that Simply Test Me button, you know, in our contributor workshops. We've also opened projects for the Google Summer of Code, where we've had people come in and help us through that. So there's all kinds of different help that we need too, especially because we're building the new framework. You know, accessibility is important to us, you know, design and UX is important to us, and code, you know, so it doesn't matter what people's skill sets are, we're welcome for any of the input. And then we also have a Drupal Slack space too, called Simply Test Me. I think it's all one word, but I could be wrong about that. And I'll let Adam talk about taking over the project and a little bit about the history. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thanks. Nice job. So a little bit about sort of where we've been and where we're going. So I had fun putting this together a while back. We've given this presentation a little bit, so we keep evolving it as we make more progress towards our future goals here. But whenever I first put this together, it was really, really fun because I went back to the Wayback Machine and I was like, give me the Simply Test back when it was started. And like the first artifacts of it were like, based on, I have a dog now, based on 2012. And you could see that it was like towards the end of the year here. And the screenshot here was from, I think it was like November 17th or whatever. And it looks like a lot different. There was like no sponsors except for Maloon. Didn't even look like there was patching, right? So like this was a really stripped down version of what was here. And it was created by Patrick D. So Patrick Drotlev, and he was the original, owner of Simply Test Me and the project. The project was basically started kind of right after Drush was started. So when Drush began, that's when I think some automation was made possible from Simply Test, and Simply Test took advantage of that to build out the capabilities, right? And just to give some folks some rough timing, so if you're thinking of history tied to Drupal, this was released during the 6 and 7 era, like sort of the split as 7 was evolving and coming out and being built, and when 6 existed. So it's been around for a long time. I mean, we're coming up on 10 years of this project already. But it's, it is now beginning, I think, to show its age a little bit, because 10-year-old technology certainly is 10-year-old technology. So here's a little bit of an architectural diagram of what kind of happens when you do Simply Test work. So we have a whole bunch of servers involved historically, where we have our web server, we have what we call our sandbox servers, and you basically go to the website, you specify what you want to test, it sends the metadata, pulls the metadata from Drupal.org to get it right, then sends it to the sandbox systems to spin up an instance. And then those instances go back when they're done. And then it finishes and it redirects the user to the new sandbox. A lot of this is very monolithical, okay? So what you're looking at here is the architectural diagram, where we do have a web server. There's one of them. We have a set of sandbox servers. There's actually only one of them now, or before. And what we did with that was, anytime we would need to make changes to that, we would actually be like modifying things on the fly, because there wasn't a backup. There wasn't a dev server or anything to that effect. For those that are more used to those things, it just doesn't exist in this old landscape. A lot of the work was very custom coded and custom configured. So many of the servers had a lot of very specific configuration. This was back before DevOps was really a thing. That configuration wasn't represented in code. It wasn't readily pullable or rebuildable. Nora, I'm on the phone. Yeah. So it was really hard to actually maintain and keep up. And we actually lost some of the servers. So we actually couldn't even load balance them, or like take one down and maintain it and bring another one up. It was pretty crazy. And one really cool fun fact about the early architecture is all these servers were running on like the precursor for Docker. So if you like Docker and you're used to containers, this was using like a proxy tool called HA proxy, and that was mapped to different containers on the back end of these various systems. And it was using LXC, and LXC is kind of foundational for where Docker came from. So if you think of like a really early raw version of Docker, that's kind of how these systems were running, which was sort of fun too. I learned a lot about that, which was really super cool. But let's talk about a little of like the limitations here. I love the image on the right, because it's 100% relevant for like the state of mind of Simply Test when I took it over. It's like we were having tons of incidents and problems, a lot of like issues. The system was going down all the time. It didn't have support for like modern Drupal 8 workflows. It didn't even have newer versions of Drush installed or supported. But at the same time, like just keeping the lights on of the service was so time consuming, right? if it was going down and needing to be maintained and the disks was filling up and all this other stuff, we needed to just do a whole bunch of stuff all the time to keep it going, to a point where we like weren't engineering or putting fixes in place to make these things more sustainable. So the image on the right, I think, is quite accurate of the kind of technical debt that we inherited originally. And where we are right now in terms of limitations, you know, is like what we got was pretty fragile and dated, had a lot of tech debt. We had a very heavy maintenance burden. Not only do we have system administration and updates or keeping up with Drupal community capabilities, but because we're an open source project, there is an expectation of customer service. People will post in our issue queues and basically say, hey, this module doesn't work on Simply Test Me. And the funny thing is that most of the scripts that run Simply Test Me are very automated. It's not doing anything too specific per module, but people were actually expecting us to help debug their modules. And it's a weird thing, right? So it's there's a between running the service and running the open source project, there's a bit of a customer service aspect here that even if the project is free, there's still an expectation of engagement and making sure that it's trying to meet people's needs. The other thing that, as I mentioned, that kind of made this really hard to keep up with is just there wasn't any development infrastructure. And when I took it over, there was no contributors to the project and we had no money. So you can imagine kind of a pretty dire state around this, and with a lot of work, not a lot of help, and not a lot of options to pay to get that help. So it was pretty rough. So so then Patrick D decided that, you know, he wanted to move on. I think he had invested a lot in the project and had done a lot of great things during the time that he was the lead, but he wanted to move on to other bigger and better things that he wanted to use his time for. But he wanted to preserve like the intentions of the project. He didn't want to like give it off to a company or you know, put any like corporate bias into it. He really wanted to maintain the free aspect of it, keep it open source, and make sure that it was governed in a way that he wanted it to be, you know, from its founding. And in 2008, you know, even coming up, I think almost on 3 years at this point, I offered to take it over, and I offered to make sure that it was led with the spirit of the project based on the way it was originally ideated and designed. And that's a handsome picture of me. So that's me right there. So since we've gone through, we've been really, I've looked at this personally as a revitalization project, and we've done a lot. We have done a lot of things. So we've not only maintained it much more actively, AmyJune has been engaged in helping us advocate and market this tool and engage with the community in a much stronger way than we ever have. We stood up an open collective to get donations from the broader community for those that find value in our service. We also had a sponsored feature by Centauro that paid for the one-click demonstration feature, which allows for even more rapidly provisioning of instances for specific use cases, umami, commerce, etc. And Tugboat QA, which we'll talk more about shortly, we were able to sunset all of the legacy infrastructure for the sandbox instances and replace it with a nice, cool, modern API-driven front backend, which is awesome. And it's all now running in a non-monolithic way. It's running in a infrastructure as code, API microservice-based architecture, very sexy, super cool. We love it. So very happy that this that the folks from Tugboat QA approached us with this and helped us to execute on this. So a little bit about the future direction of just where's the project going, aside from some of the revitalization that we've already done. There's a very heavy DevOps concentration and focus that we use when we're starting to plan out how we work on this project. And there's some key differences, I think, just to like frame yourself in terms of these concepts. One is like looking at how do we be more agile, right? How do we make sure that we're in a position of adding value, iterating well, looking at how we use more of a process for sprints or whatever. If you look at that retrospect, try to have priorities defined. You can go inside. I know the Miss 5-year-old is saying hello. Hold on one second. Okay, she's back on the iPad. We really are trying to leverage modern practices and DevOps, and I think that's what makes SimplyTest a bit unique. So we really want to understand what adds value and what we prioritize. We want that to add value back into the service and what we're doing. It's a key tenet for what we're prioritizing and why we're doing it. And we're looking at this through the lens of a DevOps-based approach, right? Where SimplyTest is an opportunity to automate things for our end users, to make it easier, to make it simpler. So there's a heavy overlap with DevOps practices, infrastructure as code, making things ephemeral, using modern practices and designs like microservices, and also getting people familiar with just DevOps practices in general as well. So if people look to contribute to SimplyTest Me, they're going to get something that looks a little close to a CI/CD pipeline, right? Which is pretty neat, but it's very Drupal centric. And I think if people want to learn about things like that for Drupal, it's a great opportunity to contribute. It's the way we've designed it. Because we want to focus on the value, we want to eliminate what doesn't add value. And so the way that we have done that is through a strict mantra or goal in our future direction of only focusing on the application. We want to eliminate everything else. We want to eliminate maintenance. We want to eliminate the burden of systems, keeping those systems up to date. We want to make it all run and owned and governed by the application. We want to make sure that everything as much as possible is doing that, and everything else around it is just serving that purpose only. So we have a really good way that we've put a stake in the ground and said, this is where we want to add value for customers, and this is exactly how we want to do it, and everything else is noise to us. We want to leverage services, we want to leverage capabilities, and we want those to serve us point blank. Some ways that we're also trying to focus on the application and eliminate all of the noise. We've completely redone the theme and the design of SimplyTest Me. 10-year-old system looks like a 10-year-old system, right? Comic Sans is no longer the coolest font that's out there, regardless of what some people say on Twitter. So we wanted to look at refreshing the design, making a theme that was modern. And I really want to thank Anna Laura, who came up with kind of the design, and Iris Ibekwe from Civic Actions, who helped to bring that to life initially and get the theme in place to kick that off and get it moving. We've since made a lot of changes and such to that, which has been awesome. We also don't want to be maintaining infrastructure. If we have a strict focus on what we want to do and how we want to build our application, infrastructure is noise. Many companies offer infrastructure for us and infrastructure services. We don't want to maintain it. We don't want to do anything with it. So we were very lucky that we had a committee of people that reviewed an open call for options to review for a PaaS web server. This replaces our SimplyTest Me web server. We've already replaced the Tugboat part. We'll talk more about that shortly. And so we're now replacing the web server itself. That's going to give us, because we're pushing everything into the application, we now will have a great and modern workflow for testing changes on demand, testing the actual application of SimplyTest Me, making sure we don't break things, kicking off a set of automated tests. And that's now going to put us in sort of the new age, right? Where we have a good modern workflow, good way to test changes. and it's going to encourage community contribution. I'm very confident of that, where people can make use of like on-demand environments and be able to test things very rapidly and quickly, combined with changes that they could contribute on our project. We're very excited about this. It's also going to be using SSL. We have an edge layer now in place, and we have a very, very fluid and highly automated code update and deployment workflow. So super excited by this. And this is offered through a partner. We're using AmyJune and Lagoon to do this. So we're very, very excited to partner with them and get this launched. It's going to offer great returns once this launches. So we're very happy that they stepped up and offered that to us. And then the next, and this is like kind of going to segue into the future or the rest of the presentation, is we probably for the last I would say the last year and a half, we have been completely rewriting Simply Test Me from the ground up. We started with a brand new branch on Drupal.org. It started in Drupal 8, completely rewriting our application. There's been various people that have been involved in this effort with time. So I certainly can't do that justice. But it is the way that we have engineered it now, based on the capabilities of Drupal 8 and Drupal 9, it is radically simplified. There was a pull request at one point that I think Matt actually had worked on, and we did a diff from like various commits at one point in time, that we had removed something along the lines of like 40,000 lines of code out of the code base with almost near feature parity. And we're treating Drupal 9 in a really, really excellent way. It's a great use case for Drupal. It really makes it shine. All of the underlying entity system and type data system and the services layer that Drupal is able to offer natively really, really, really shines in this case. And the cool thing is we're treating Drupal 9 now as like a governor. It's the thing that orchestrates our application. It's a thing that orchestrates Tugboat, writes the definitions of Tugboat, we also built a React decoupled front end. So it's also leveraging and pulling data from Drupal itself. And all of that interfaces directly back in with the Tugboat QA instances, all through a microservice-based architecture, both in the React, the Drupal governor and orchestrator, and through Tugboat. It's a really, really sweet way that this is being architected at this point. And it has significantly reduced the technical debt that we inherited from day one on the project. So I can't be more excited about the way that this is evolving and turning out. I'm going to turn it over to Matt because he has a lot more good news to share on this front. So Matt, the floor is yours.
All right, can I get a boot? So one of the biggest things with Simply Test Me is it is a very robust form that lets you pick many, many different things. And Drupal's form API is pretty awesome, honestly. Like you can have a pretty reactive interface without writing any JavaScript code via Ajax operations and a few other items. But not many folks know that when you use elements that aren't buttons to use Ajax, it begins to break very quickly. And with Drupal Commerce, Boyan and myself found this in many ways, where if a select list fires an Ajax request that adds more elements to the form, like a button, Drupal forgets what button you actually pressed because to Drupal, that button didn't exist. So I came into this knowing like, okay, the form API has limitations and we want to add things like additional projects and patching those additional projects so you can have a very custom build. We needed to put the Drupal form API out of the way. And also this makes it easier for outside contributors by building a JavaScript front end. So we picked React. So it's a React front end that builds out the form. And it makes it a little bit easier to decouple the user interface from the user backend, or not from the user, from the business logic in the backend. So now we have an API as our contract. It just communicates over an API. And the next slide talks about some of those benefits. So as I said, the JavaScript, it makes it more familiar for JavaScript developers, which there are more of those in the community now. And it just we don't have to deal with a lot of form API hacks. So what the decoupling allowed us to do is to say, all right, what is the payload that launches a preview or a sandbox? So we're able to work on that data definition that's a contract, which means the JavaScript front end builds that JSON payload. Drupal receives it and it goes and does things. And all we have to worry about is say, if you add this new parameter, we go do things. Where like the Drupal 7 site or anybody that's built like a form knows, like you start adding stuff and it's like, oh, is set, not empty. You start doing all these fun things into it. The next slide. And to accomplish this, we didn't use the JSON API module or the RESTful Web Services module because those would be overkill. We have like 2 endpoints. Rather, we have one that receives data. So using one of those modules would have been a lot of overkill. However, to make sure that we had a system that allowed for validation, we used the typed data system, which if you've worked with entities are a typed data not abstraction, because an entity has fields which are typed data, and it just goes all the way down. So typed data is like the very, very, very low level of the data system inside of Drupal. So we're able to define this data definition, and we can take that JSON payload, turn it into, decode it, pass it to the typed data system, and say, validate this. And if anything's not valid, we can return errors to the front end or ensure that we have a properly formed array of PHP data. So this has made it also really easy and avoids that idea of like, oh, we added a new property. Like that part of the code that Adam brought up with the removal, a chunk of that was removing some GitHub code. When we get to Tugboat, we can talk about that. But also all these like is set, not empty, all the hard-coded logic checks you have to do like on an array, we were able to leverage the Symfony validation system and constraints that are inside Drupal. Say, bam, hey, is this... Actually, go to the next slide if you could, Adam. And there, it's... hopefully it's readable. It's kind of readable. But here we're able to say that the string Drupal version must not be blank and be the primitive type. Why do we have 2 different versions there? I found out not blank means not null. So somebody could put like an integer or a float and it would validate. So then you had to have primitive type as well. So you had to have the 2 whammies. I don't have to add any custom logic. I'm using and leveraging the constraints here. And on the next slide, we should have even more examples. Or not. We just show how we validate it. So we're able to take the request content, the JSON, decode it into an array, say, hey, type data manager, here's the definition, here's the array payload, convert it into actual data. If we received an error, we throw an unavailable exception, and then we validate it. And if there's any constraints, we return those errors to the front end. So it gets like, oh, you provided an invalid Drupal core version. Hey, that version doesn't exist for the module. It allows us to have all this, like all of that validation logic inside of, encapsulated inside the validation system, and not just loose code that says, hey, I've got this data, let's write a whole bunch of if-else statements, and we know how how unbearable that can quickly become when you just have your own logic written out. So we can go to the next slide. So optimizing and refactoring. So to go back to that line about like 4,000 lines being deleted. So how before when Simply Test first adopted Tugboat, Tugboat listens to a repository. So it says given branch gets a commit, build a preview. Well, how it had to work is Simply Test had the GitHub API integrated, and when you configure the form, actually on the D7 site is still doing this. That GitHub repo has 160,000 branches and kills the GitHub user interface. It makes a new branch and commits the changes to the config.yaml, which triggers the Tugboat build. Due to advances in the Tugboat API, like creating previews via an API request with a payload, we are able to remove all the GitHub integration, all this extra code, and be more nimble with it, which has been phenomenal to work with. I'm able to run unit tests. Like we have unit tests in Simply Test Me that configures a build sends it to Tugboat if you have your secrets enabled, waits for it to finish building, and confirms the test or not. So we actually have end-to-end test integration with Tugboat to verify that the sample build files work, at least create a successful build. We can go to the next slide. So what the heck is a Tugboat? Is pre-production infrastructure as code. So it's like CI/CD, but for your for ephemeral previews. Like, hey, I need you to test this out. It's hosted agnostic, which is one reason I love it. So like sidebar, I am a platform.sh fanboy. And mostly it was because of like the preview environments. But now that I have Tugboat, I don't care where something's hosted because I get my preview environments and I'm all happy about it. So it's got a ton of DevOps for other projects. And if you want to learn more, you can go to hello@tugboat.qa and say hi to Bernice, the fact-checking goat. Because they're all about their goats, even though it's a tugboat and goats don't like water. What's the next slide? So the Tugboat preview configuration. So when you configure Tugboat, it's like configuring any other CI. It's a lot of YAML in different steps, and you type it all out. They have various things like an init command, which runs at the beginning. Build, which is something that should always run. It's all in their docs. And actually, we can update this. It's not working to standardized generation. We've built a standardized generation inside our own configuration generator. In the future, we're gonna unify more of the custom builds with one-click demos, so it'd be very easy for anyone to contribute and improve the build pipeline that we develop. Go to the next slide. New Tugboat API compatibilities. Spoiler alert, I already talked about this. It removed a lot of the code because now we make one HTTP request and we create a preview. One of the really cool things is our progress build is communicating directly to Tugboat and shows the streamed build process as well with that coming out. So we can go to the next one. Improve build progress tracking. So as anyone has tried the current site, you probably got like a failure at 113%. I'm like, what? Whoa. I know I did, but that's because before the build actually would ping simplytest.me and say, hey, I'm at this point in time, and it would create a database record. So the failure, it said 113% because there was like 12 entries out of 10. So it was above. But now, as we're doing builds, we actually have echo statements that say, simply test patching stage, download stage, whatever it is. And the React app reads that and uses that to gauge the progress. We have like 5 steps. So when it hits step 1, it says we're at blah, blah, blah percentage. And it uses a fancy HTML progress bar too. So it's all fancy. So thanks, Tugboat, for improving your API, which makes simplytest.me better. The next one. Relatable code base. So I think this is the fun part. As I said in the beginning with some of the intros, I wanted to contribute to simplytest a long time ago. But I looked at the code and I was like, I don't have a week to just sit and figure this out. So I'm hoping that with Drupal 9, the code's a little bit more familiar. There's still a lot of boilerplate code and some extra modules that we're cleaning up. But between that, it's D9. It has tests. It has mostly clean code that a lot of folks can dive in, and it doesn't have as many intricacies. We're not talking to GitHub to make a commit to trigger a build in Tugboat. We're making an HTTP request. Oh, I get that. And the other exciting part is we do have. I don't know if I've spent my entire Drupal career working on distributions and profiles, so it's actually a lot of a more interesting approach. So we have a website repository that automatically pulls in simplytest the profile from Drupal.org, deploys it to Lagoon. We have a GitHub action script that nightly checks if we should deploy to production. So I'm hoping that by being relatable, it also has a lot of cool examples for people to look at for how we run and automate this project. I think that's one of the most exciting things is examples on how others do stuff. And I'm hoping simplytest provides that.
Cool. Thank you, Matt. So yeah, that wraps up our formal presentation. One thing I think that we probably weren't highly explicit about is, when would we expect this new system to go? And I think the answer to that is like really soon. So we are right on the cusp, I believe, of having a lot of the new stuff in place and available for people, and switching over from the old system and shutting down all of the old legacy stuff.
Great. Thank you all for that really in-depth presentation. And you know what? It's super exciting. I remember using the early stages of Simply Test and thinking like, this is super useful. I wish it was better. And now you guys are making it better. So that's awesome. There were a couple of questions in the chat. Is there a reason Simply Test.me defaults to Drupal 8.9? I was testing some contrib modules today and found it used 8.9x.
I think, do you want to answer it, Adam, or me?
Yeah, we are not actively, we are investing a significant amount of energy into getting the new system done, right? We're really at a point that, we're within days of launching this, not weeks, months, or even years away. To that end, during the time we've been making this heavy investment in this new system, Drupal has still been doing releases. And there are aspects of the legacy system that are manual, like basically setting what is the default and things of that nature. And we have not, kept up with that for valid reasons. But the new system can and should be much, much, much more capable of handling that dynamically. So we feel pretty good about at least where it's going. But yeah, if you take a look at where it is today, you will probably be a bit underwhelmed.
Next question. Might Simply Test Me be promoted or suggested at drupal.org/try Drupal?
That's a great question. I don't know. I believe, and I may be wrong on this, but I believe that is a paid thing, I think, through Drupal.org.
Yeah, that's a partner page. So we would have to do a lot of fundraising to get Simply Test Me up on there.
There might even be a chance we could ask for that kind of capability.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing though is that we have specific SLAs in how the system is expected to be used that are not permanent. Like we're not offering hosting or doing anything in a permanent way that if you're trying Drupal, you might want to go to a partner or something that can give you like infrastructure that you could spin up that would stick around a bit more. But trying Drupal in terms of like, hey, you want to get your hands dirty and test some things out. Yeah, that would be certainly possible and based on what we offer. So I think it's an option. I'm not sure. Maybe that's something that we can dig into a bit more.
A couple other questions coming in here. Where can we find the recorded presentation? That's a great question, Bob. It'll be up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. No, let's put it this way, no longer than a week, but yeah, within the week, we'll call it. Catherine's asking, how are Tugboat and Simply Test Me related? Is there a dependency on Tugboat?
There absolutely is. We historically used old, we called sandbox servers. So the sandbox server was an Apache, and it was like a LAMP stack with virtual hosts. And every time that we would spin up a new instance on Simply Test Me, we would create a new virtual host and do like a soft reboot of Apache. And that was based on a very monolithic infrastructure. And anytime that we wanted to make changes, we would basically, um, struggle because we would take down all the instances that were running at any given point in time or do anything. So it was pretty problematic the way it was architected. So we decided to architect using Tugboat QA as the backend. And the reason why it's a little bit specific is all of their API endpoints are specific to their product. So the way that we interface with that system is why it is unique and why it is tightly coupled. In the future, should anything change with Tugboat or we want to replace the backend, at least we know that we would be working to build different API definitions that would match whatever interfaces were required by another system. But we are really, really happy, and I'm very thrilled to partner with Tugboat QA on this, and their offering is great and their API services are great. And we've, as they've evolved, we've been able to evolve. It's been a very symbiotic and helpful relationship, and we can't say enough good things about what they offer and their generous partnership with Simply Test.
Hold on a second, I'm muted. If I unmute, you can hear the question. Can Simply Test Me use issue forks as well as apply patches? In short, can you use Composer patches to tell Composer that a Drupal 8 module is compatible with the Drupal 9, but there's a workaround involving issue forks?
Oh, this is so on the roadmap is support for an issue fork over a patch. But I didn't even consider this as the use case for testing, like, oh, this says it's incompatible. Well, we're going to point it at the issue fork because that allows us to install it with Composer. We know this needs to be done. I don't know how or I'm going to do this. Like I started right now, let's put it this way. I started to explore with it indirectly. I tried to turn like my maintainer release note command into a, to fork it out and be able to run it without the Git repository by querying the GitLab API. And even then I'm having some interesting things happen. And there's the fact that, so I guess it depends. It depends on how it could work. Is it as simple like add this project, override with issue fork, and then you copy the issue fork like repo? Or does it show a drop down and we try to fetch all the available issue forks? But Drupal.org doesn't clean up old stale merge requests or issue forks anymore, so that would be heavily polluted.
So that makes sense. I think the only way that you can actually get this to work, it's a weird tweak. And what you actually have to do is add to your Composer JSON.
Yeah.
You add a new repository that comes from the issue fork, and then you tell the Drupal repository to ignore that packet. And then you can like bootstrap something that otherwise Drupal 9 won't load it so it can patch it. It won't be available to patch, right?
Yeah.
Because Drupal 9 thinks, oh, it's only for Drupal 8. I can't even get that thing. It's that one line, right? Just the one line in info.yaml that says, oh, you can use me with this one or that one. Yeah. You can't use Composer patches from C. Wiegand's to patch that one line because it won't be available in Drupal 9. Like you can't get it to patch it. So that's, and so essentially the only, like you wouldn't really be able to, I would not know how to do that with a menu or whatever. You would have to do that with Composer JSON that people can.
So like we build the JSON, so like we could script that because I've done that trick a few times. The hard part I've been having issues with is what would that look like on the configuration form when setting up the simplytest.me page. So that's when I am all ears for if it's like, oh, if it was like add additional project, use issue fork instead, and it was like copy the URL to the issue fork, and it's that. Like I can like I can live like that might be the only way because, like I said, Drupal again, my problem, the hardest part I see here is actually the user interface because stale merge requests and issue forks don't get cleaned up. They're kind of persisting forever. So somebody said, the examples I always use is like password policy. That's what I go through. It's like password policy, use issue fork. You might see like 30 issue forks to choose from. It's like, what one do I want? At that point, it seems almost easier. Like if you know what you're doing, you put it in a text box. So I feel like the hardest part with issue forks is going to be the user interface.
Yeah, definitely.
I think
very sympathetic to that.
I think if it's in the advanced options section, which it currently is, like applying patches, you should expect that people
They kind of know what they're doing.
should be able to provide the information that they would need to. But also, I think there's still a limitation on using one issue fork at a time with Composer, if I'm correct.
Yep. So
Yeah,
if you
so-
did that,
I
you
actually
can apply
think
multiple.
that's not true, actually, because I'm doing a Drupal 8 to 9. It's blowing my mind. Stuff I'm learning right now. It's crazy. I thought it was supposed to be really easy, but like there's so many weird little edge cases. But anyway, you can. It's like an array of things that you're passing to tell Drupal. Like you can add as many new repos as you want before you load the Drupal repo, and then you tell the Drupal repo to ignore as many packages as you want. It's an array of like package names that are just string, comma, string, comma. So I thought it was
I
only
meant per project.
yeah.
Like you can only have one issue fork for an individual project.
I don't know about that either.
Yeah, you could only have one. So you would have to. So to go into that part, that's where you would say, I need this main fork and then apply other patches to it. Basically, is what that would be.
Our last question here: does the new version have a time limit for how long is the local site available on Tugboat for the users to evaluate?
Yep, great question. I think it's set to 24 hours now. We are also very cognizant that increasing that or making things permanent, people don't go back and clean up, so that actually does have a net effect on our infrastructure and on the Tugboat service. I think we have it set either to 12 or 24 hours. I'm pretty sure it's 24. The nice thing about it is that when we spin it up from Tugboat, we can specify exactly how long. So it's right in code, like when we spin the request and say, here's the configuration we want, and here's the time that we want, and it automatically handles that for us. It's a pretty nice feature. That's sort of what sold me initially, was when I saw that, I was like, pretty much fits our use case, right? So we were able to use that, and we definitely will look to evaluate that with time. But one thing I would mention that hurts our case for improving that is that when camps come and when DrupalCon comes, this system gets hammered. And so we watch our Tugboat usage go from like normal levels of like reasonable to, oh my God, this thing is going to go down, right? And it's like just shoots up like exponentially over a period of time, especially when there's contrib days and contrib events, and it's very heavily used. So we try not to expand beyond that SLA as of right now, but it's always an ongoing conversation.
Great. And the reason I ask Adam is, I've used it a ton in terms of mentoring and contributions and that kind of stuff. And I see the 24 hours as being completely legitimate, because if you're testing a patch and you're applying it, whatever, typically that's done relatively quickly. But I also have used it forever for training. So when people, and I always encourage people, when you want to check out a new module, do it through Simply Test Me. But for instance, if I was doing commerce, it takes a while to set that up and get that correct, right. So is that the right solution for me? I want to encourage folks to use Simply Test Me for that purpose, but it sometimes would take longer than a day to do that. So I'm wondering if there's like during high traffic, peak times like contribution days and DrupalCon and all that, you could have a 12-hour or whatever, but then maybe make it longer, or maybe make it based on the module that people are installing or something. And I'm just asking that because, folks have come to me and said, I spent all this time, you recommended this, I spent all this time setting up, and then it's gone after 24 hours or whatever. But anyway, thank
Yeah.
you. Great job on this tool. Like I said, use it. I promote it all the time. So thanks for all your efforts, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we would be open to looking at a feature like that could be negotiable on the time. We would still ultimately, want to tear things down at some point. We have actually talked about, even as a way of getting more donations, having paid features that you can have persistent sandboxes, like, that a user could have 3 to 5 or something that they could run and have it stand up indefinitely, and they would have a way of managing that and tied to their donations and whatnot that they make. Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation. I totally get that if you're if you've configured 17 projects and you've loaded a whole bunch of patches and you've configured it and you're like demoing something the next day for a group of people, it's certainly, the timing of when the instances shut down can be a hindrance on that. We've also even, believe it or not, we've even talked about ways that you can take an instance and like convert it to something else. So like you could either extract things really easily, like the database or the configuration or the code, and get some sort of an archive, and then transition that archive somewhere that might be more permanent. And that we would also frame, at least from the other side of the permanency, as a sponsorship opportunity, something we haven't necessarily explored yet. But if we could offer a gateway to spinning up a site on a past provider as an example, that's an opportunity for Simply Test to have some revenue coming in as well, that we could offer. Yeah.
I like both those ideas, actually. I think for somebody who's going to spin up a site and wants to keep it for a demo or something next day, the labor that would go into rebuilding it would certainly be worth the donation to keep it up for a long amount of time. And the same way that if you want to throw it into DDEV or throw it into some local site because you want to use that as the basis of what you're doing, because now you've got it all configured, it's going to be what you want to use. So let's just start with that. So I like both those ideas. So thank you.
Thanks.
This last question is a good one. How much faster is the new version of Simply Test in building a fresh Drupal site and applying a patch compared to the current legacy version?
My general answer, and I see Matt pondering it too, so I certainly will rely on his response in this. Much of the definitions of what we create are the same between the current version and the new one we're about to release. The definitions are what spins up on Tugboat, right? That's actually what takes time. That's what pulls the logs. I don't think we've changed them drastically because they're technically working. If we have, we've just made nominal improvements to what has been there. I would say we haven't necessarily made huge performance gains in that, just because the definitions are the same. But maybe Matt would have a different opinion. I'm not sure.
So
I have a little bit different of opinion. I don't know how much work Matt's done recently because I poke in there every once in a while in the new one. And there's definitely less hang time, but there still is hang time, like where sometimes you come back and you're like, is it gonna spin up? I don't know. But on some things where it's super easy, I've noticed a little bit of an improvement.
Yeah, it's one that theoretically it will be faster because it has more dedicated hardware for spinning up an environment. Is one way. We just found out an interesting problem where, so Tugboat has this concept of base previews. So you do like a base preview, and then you can create, kind of like when you build a Docker image. You build something, and then you can make a version that builds on top of it, so that way it takes up less disk space and is faster. we have that, but I found out that if you change the image name, it seems like that base preview kind of just isn't used. It's not like it uses part of it. So recently on dev, our builds have been a little bit slower, but I just did an umami demo and I think it took like 20 seconds to spin up, maybe less, where that's not too bad. You know, definitely it has not hit the performance improvement problems, but we're getting there. Like, that's the exciting part. Like how Adam said, like, we're talking days. It's not like, oh, great, well, we can talk about managing the base previews via code in the API instead of them being this like base branch. Like the base branch I accidentally deleted and broke the dev site. So we're getting to that, and I would love to get to the point of speeding up the builds, because there's definitely some stuff in the builds that I'm like, do we really need that? But right now, that's also the hardest thing to debug, because it takes time, and I am so impatient. It is also fast enough that I have a unit test that runs, and I did like 20 of them in I think half an hour on a live stream when I was working on simplytest.me. Like, obviously there's some gap time while I was like tweaking code, but it wasn't that long. We're not talking minutes. It's definitely like 30 seconds is the longest I think I've had to wait. Maybe 45.
One last question here. Do you have any direct marketing tools users can subscribe to? Is that more of a question for me, Tim, or for the Simply Test team?
For the Simply Test.
Yeah, I figured. Okay.
Kind of. So we have a Twitter account that we use. We also have our Open Collective account, which we're not active really on. We probably could do a better job of posting updates, but we're also very discretional about where we invest the funds to make sure we're getting as much mileage out of it. Yeah. And exactly what Matt said, like, we don't have a newsletter. It's not, yeah, we're not like, I don't feel like we have like enough people or movement on things. It's like that, you know, the updates are so frequent, and like, you know, people are just like dialing in and waiting for like the next tweet to come in. But ironically, one thing that I've been writing, and Matt and AmyJune are aware of this, I've actually been writing a blog post for literally the last 3 months now that is going to be the giant recap of everything that has gone on with Simply Test pretty much since like I took it over. So I wouldn't call that a newsletter. I would almost call that a novel. And it's going to be pretty cool though, whenever it comes out. But one thing that I'm looking to do, and I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way that probably you're not expecting. We are going to, once we get the new site launched, we're going to be much more methodical about leveraging product level best practices. We're going to be establishing a roadmap for Simply Test Me. We're going to be trying to set quarterly goals. We're going to talk about those goals and why we're prioritizing those goals. So what we're expecting over time is, because we'll be moving our focus away from maintaining the legacy stuff into more of, you know, enhancing and serving the customer through the application, we're going to be in a much better position to talk about incremental value, talk about what we're doing while we're doing it, prioritize certain things, and make it something that the product of Simply Test Me has a lot of life breathed into it, and people can see what we're doing over time and engage in that and offer feedback. And things like merge request keeps coming up, right? We also, our next quarterly milestone is like, make sure we've delivered something stable. Like, that is our number one goal after launching our new site, is like, be responsive to anything that comes up, make sure we're in a position of addressing it, shipping changes quickly, bug fixing, getting everybody enabled with the new system, and really kind of digging in at that level, right? Merge requests would probably be up there, like I said, and then looking at, you know, some other stuff in the future. But we have a lot of good ideas that we're stewing and marinating on. Maybe at that point that would be worth a quarterly newsletter or something like that. But, you know, stay tuned. And, you know, we're definitely pivoting things into the way that'll make it much more fluid in the way that we want to deliver new things and cool things, and engage with the community to make it successful.
So
And if somebody watches this and wants to be your new marketing manager, can they reach out to you, Adam, to take that on?
You can reach out to AmyJune. She's my
reach out to
delegate.
me. Yeah. So, but Tim, to answer your question much shorter than Adam's is, you can subscribe to his blog because that's where the updates come from.
I'll do that.
And follow.
Yeah,
and
I don't
follow
use
them on
Twitter.
Twitter, right?
I'm
There
not
you
a
go.
Twitter user, so that's, yeah, okay.
Maybe we should be seeking ghostwriting or something. I don't know. Like there could be different options here.
But Leslie has a good point. Like, you know, the marketing is something that we could always use help on. And there's always a place for everyone with Drupal contributions, you know, so we don't just need coders, but we need like the designers and the copywriters and things like that too. So, yeah.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate your time, and this brings another Drupal Providence to a close. I am not going to kick you all out of here, but I will stop the recording in just a minute. Before I do that, though, I did want to note that Design for Drupal Boston is doing a webinar on September 15th at noon. Justin Topin is going to be talking about layout paragraphs. So if you are interested in that, you can go to the Design for Drupal website and sign